I want to again welcome you on behalf of the American Psychological Foundation and thank you for joining us for this APF at Home Fireside Chat. This is the fourth chat honoring the 2023 recipients of the APF Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology. I'm Dr. Doug Haldeman, an APF trustee, and I am really excited to have the opportunity to be here today with one of our recipients, Dr. Mark Hatzenbuehler. As the premier private grant-making foundation in psychology, APF awards over $1 million annually in grants, scholarships, and awards supporting psychologists and students using psychology to address major issues and improve lives. APF is unique in that it receives the overwhelming majority of its funding from individuals like those of you joining us today, and we cannot express enough our gratitude to your investment in APF and the important research we continue to fund. As we proceed through the conversation today, if you have any questions for Dr. Hatzenbuehler, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature, which you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will do our best to address all questions at the conclusion of the program. Now it is my absolute pleasure to formally introduce today's guest, Dr. Mark Hatzenbuehler. Dr. Hatzenbuehler was awarded this honor in recognition of his paradigm-shifting approach to understanding and attenuating mental health disparities. Dr. Hatzenbuehler has worked to position structural stigma as a fundamental cause of population disparities in psychiatric morbidity and other health outcomes, and to identify the mechanisms through which stigma compromises health from a theoretically driven multi-method research program focused on biopsychosocial mechanisms. His research has explored the impact of stigma and discrimination on minority communities, specifically LGBTQIA plus populations. More than any other person in the field, Dr. Hatzenbuehler has given life to so-called structural stigma by creatively deploying data about contexts to show how they affect the mental health, suicide risk, and even longevity of gay and lesbian individuals. And here I have to just say on a personal note, Mark's research has been an absolute game changer for all of us who work in the field of LGBTQ psychology. I cannot myself think of a paper I've published, a book I've written, a book chapter, anything that I've written in the last 10 or 15 years where I haven't cited some of Mark's work. And to him, I and lots of other people working in the field are very grateful. Mark, you are a real hero for our community. And I want to say again, welcome, Dr. Hatzenbuehler.
Thank you. Thank you for those lovely words. And I just want to start by thanking my nominators in the selection committee for this incredible honor. I'm really just so pleased and humbled to receive the award this year.
Well deserved, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts today. So let's dive right in.
Great.
Mark, your career has been defined by an extensive body of research in stigma, mental health disparities, and the impact of social context on health outcomes. This groundbreaking research has advanced the understanding of stigma-related health disparities and influenced policy decisions and interventions. Can you share a bit about the journey that led you to focus on this area?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say is that I never actually expected to be sitting here having this conversation with you. I think in many ways, I still consider myself somewhat of an accidental academic. I actually went into the field thinking that I wanted to be a therapist. But in working with clients from stigmatized groups, I sort of kept having this experience where despite making some gains in treatment, I, was sending them back out into the same environment that in many cases was generating a lot of the problems that they were encountering. And so that experience really led to a profound shift in my career. I think that, in some ways I decided maybe the best way to help my clients, I had to get out of the therapy room and into the broader community in order to better understand how stigma was manifesting in the institutions and broader contexts in which my clients were embedded. And so I was lucky at the time that I was having this insight. I think luck will be a key theme throughout our conversation today, but I was really lucky to be taking a graduate course in psychology that one of my mentors, Jack DeVideo, was teaching called Stereotyping and Prejudice. And he exposed us to some readings by two sociologists of stigma, Bruce Link and Joe Phelan. And they were talking about this idea that stigma, isn't just in the minds of stigmatized individuals, and it's not just evident in their social interactions. Stigma also exists at structural levels. And so both that theoretical literature that I was reading and also my own, personal experiences as a therapist was really leading me to begin to see the importance of studying stigma at that broad structural level. But I kind of confronted a problem, which was that with some exceptions, psychologists had really tended to be studying stigma only at the levels of individual perceptions and social interactions. And so as a consequence, it became clear to me at that point in my training that as important as my training as a psychologist had been, I really would need to incorporate other disciplinary perspectives to study broader structural forms of stigma. And so for the first 2 years after grad school, I did a postdoc in population health, actually with those same two sociologists that we had read in Jack's course, Bruce Link and Joe Phelan. And then I was lucky to stay on as a faculty member in that same department, in the Department of Social Sciences and Public Health for the next 8 years. And one of the amazing things about that job was my office was next to sociologists and anthropologists and epidemiologists and political scientists and historians, all of whom really deeply influenced my thinking and my approaches to measurement and sampling and methods as I was initiating, this line of work on structural stigma. And then finally, about 4 years ago, I decided that the time was right, actually, for a move back to psychology, where I could establish a new set of collaborations with psychologists that would enable us to really kind of continue and expand the work on structural stigma in new directions. So, as you can see, it's been a somewhat circuitous path, but one that I think has really helped me to explore this complex human predicament that we call stigma from multiple different angles.
Well, I have to say, it does not surprise me at all that your journey started clinically and working with the members of our community who I would have to say, at least in my experience, were so profoundly impacted by the social environment in which we live. And you're right, you work with people, but then you send them back out into the same environment, hopefully better prepared to deal with it, but it is still fascinating to me that led you to actually address the environment itself. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, I guess I'm wondering what some of the challenges are that you encountered while developing methodologies for studying structural stigma and how you worked past them.
Yeah. So, I think, we've all been sort of made so much more aware of issues of structural inequalities in the last several years, where topics related to structural stigma and discrimination, I think, have, really been at the center of the public discourse. These issues include structural sexism in the Me Too movement, structural racism and the Black Lives Matter movement, and structural xenophobia and the contestation over immigration, here in the US and globally. And so this kind of raises the obvious question of, well, if there's this kind of widespread acknowledgement that structural stigma exists and likely shapes the lives of marginalized people, why haven't we as a field been studying it more? And, I think the answer in part really speaks to your question, which is that we as psychologists really confronted a lot of challenges in doing this work. And there, a couple in particular that I think are worth mentioning. The first was just, if you're going to study a phenomenon, you have to measure it, right? And so at the time I started, there was really a lack of structural level measures of stigma. And that was really because psychologists had been examining and therefore measuring stigma, almost exclusively at the individual and interpersonal levels of analysis. And so the first step was that the field had to really develop structural level measures that were capable of reliably and validly capturing this construct. And again, this theme of luck comes back up. It just so happened at the time that I started studying structural stigma about 15 years ago, that an opportunity to measure it emerged in the form of state policy surrounding LGBTQ populations. So during this time, particularly the last decade where I was conducting a lot of this work, there was enormous, change occurring across U.S. states with respect to laws and policies that either restricted or expanded protections for this group. And so that variability meant that we had a measure of structural stigma in the form of these laws and policies that were changing over both geographic time and space. And that's a methodological feature that's a lot less kind of discernible and pronounced for most other stigmatized groups. And so while studying LGBTQ populations is certainly important in its own right, it also provided a really relevant and rare test case for exploring this broader, set of questions about the consequences of structural forms of stigma across a range of stigmatized groups. And then another challenge that I think is worth mentioning that psychologists confronted is just the lack of variation in structural stigma in most psychological data sets. And that's because most psychological studies of stigma tend to be done in a single place, either in the lab or in a single community. And I should point out, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that approach. It's entirely appropriate for studies that are interested in explaining variation at the individual and interpersonal levels of analysis. But because those studies are done in a single place, there's no variability in structural factors. So that is the social context is what we call a ubiquitous exposure. So you can't examine structural stigma as a predictor of any outcomes when there's no variation at the contextual level. And so that meant as a field that we really had to significantly expand the number of sites in our research studies in order to increase that variation. And one of the ways that we did that was to follow the lead of epidemiologists and other disciplines through the use of large-scale population-based data sets. And the real advantage there is that these data sets strategically sample individuals across a range of social contexts that vary with respect to the level of structural stigma. So in both those cases, both measurement and sampling, we had to overcome a set of challenges. And in doing so, we've really been able to expand the way that we approach the psychological study of stigma.
A related question or ancillary question, I guess, Mark, is that, you have been recognized for your multidisciplinary collaborations, particularly with fields such as law, epidemiology, and sociology, and how they intersect with the consequences of stigma. Can you talk some about a few examples of these multidisciplinary collaborations and how they can allow psychology to broaden its own impact?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to say is that for any concept as complex and enduring as stigma, I think no single discipline can, fully understand it. And it's, I think, an inherently interdisciplinary phenomenon. And so as a consequence, I think it's really incumbent upon researchers to really evaluate it from multiple different perspectives. And I think one of the ways that other disciplines can help us expand our impact in psychology is through considering other research methods for examining stigma. So the traditional approach that psychology has used to study stigma is typically lab-based experiments. And experiments, of course, offer numerous advantages, but they also constrain what's possible to study to those phenomena that are amenable to manipulation. And that presents a challenge when you're interested, like I am, in the study of macrosocial exposures like structural stigma, where it's either infeasible or unethical to randomly assign individuals to live in high structural stigma contexts. The IRB is not going to let me randomly assign individuals to live in high stigma contexts, nor should they. And so that requires that we as psychologists really, expand our methodological toolkit to explore structural stigma beyond lab-based paradigms. And so to do that, our lab has looked to inspiration from other fields like epidemiology and economics that employ a really different set of methods for causal inference, including quasi-experiments that permit the examination of structural level factors like structural stigma that can't be randomly assigned. So one of the real methodological benefits of quasi-experiments is that they represent exogenous events that occur outside the control of individuals. And so they really minimize threats to validity of self-selection into the exposure status, in this case, structural stigma. So I'll give maybe just one example of a study that illustrates that point of a quasi-experiment. So this is a project that my colleague, Julia Raithman, took the lead on. And in this study, we used what's called a difference in difference analysis. So it's an econometrics approach for the use with quasi-experimental data. And this method enabled us to compare changes in mental distress from 2014 to 2016 among LGBT individuals and heterosexuals who lived in 3 states that had recently implemented laws denying public accommodation services to same-sex couples in the year 2015. So that was our proxy measure of structural stigma in this study. And we then compared that with changes in mental distress during the same time period, so between 2014 and 2016, among LGBT individuals and heterosexuals, again, who lived in 6 geographically nearby control states that had nearly identical demographic characteristics, but hadn't implemented one of those laws denying services to same-sex couples. And then our data on mental health and sexual orientation came from representative data sets of state residents living in those states who were 18 and over. And we found in the study that the only group to experience a significant increase in mental distress between these years, 2014 to 2016, were the LGBT individuals living in one of those states that had passed the laws denying services to same-sex couples. And that was equivalent to about a 46% relative increase in sexual minority adults experiencing mental distress in those states. So a fairly substantial increase. But in contrast, we saw no changes in mental distress among any of the other 3 comparison groups. So that is LGBT individuals living in states that didn't pass those laws, but also straight people living in states that did and did not pass those laws. And so we're documenting result specificity just to the stigmatized group that's exposed to structural stigma. And the reason that result specificity is important in terms of improving or strengthening the inferences you can draw is that when relationships between structural stigma and adverse outcomes are observed only among the stigmatized group, it increases the likelihood that the results are due to structural stigma itself and not to factors that might be associated with it, like, for example, worse economic conditions. That should theoretically also be affecting the non-stigmatized group in a similar manner, but that's not what we find in these results. So that's just one example of how we've used multidisciplinary collaborations to expand the set of research methods that we're able to use to explore some of the health consequences of structural stigma.
I'd like to turn now to the topic of advocacy and how your work has been used in the legislative arena, for example. And I don't mean to start answering your own question for you, but I do remember some years ago when I was working with the legislature here in California to develop the first legislation prohibiting the use of conversion therapy, so-called conversion therapy, by licensed mental health professionals. And of course, my first argument was it's not therapy. But secondly, it is, in fact, part of the overall social context that convinces people they should send their kids to conversion therapy, or that there is something inherently to be devalued about same-sex attraction. And so I wonder if you could speak a little more broadly than that about how your own work has impacted state-level anti-LGBTQ policies on mental health outcomes and influence policies and legal decisions affecting those in our LGBTQ plus community.
Sure. So I've been really fortunate to be involved in the William T. Grant Scholars Program, and they're committed to the use of research evidence to reduce inequalities through what they call the 3 Ps, policies, programs, and practices. And so where possible, I've tried to sort of follow this guideline to think about, when it's relevant, how our findings might be useful in those 3 domains. And so in terms of policies and practices, our work has been used both domestically and internationally. So, for instance, the Australian Psychological Society cited several of our research studies in their ethical guidelines for psychological practice with LGBT clients, and also in some of their policy briefs to the Australian Senate's Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee during the debates over same-sex marriage. And then here in the US, I've worked with other social scientists and lawyers in the creation of amicus briefs for court cases on status-based discrimination. We've reviewed how our research and the research of many, many other social psychologists and stigma scholars can address questions of interest to the courts. And that, that work's been really rewarding, not only because I've been able to see sort of directly some of the practical relevance, but also I think it's generated new research ideas. So in fact, we've had at least 3 projects come out of conversations and collaborations with legal scholars. So I think it can often work both ways, where these experiences can end up being really generative of different research ideas. And then finally, in terms of programs, our work has been used in the creation of new programs focused on LGBT health disparities, particularly intervention programs. So, while the field had sort of repeatedly demonstrated that stigma affects the health of marginalized groups, including LGBT individuals, the mechanisms, the psychological and social mechanisms underlying that relationship were less well understood. And when you are seeking to try and develop psychological interventions, you, of course, really need a good understanding of what the mechanisms are so that you can target them in interventions. And so many years ago, I developed a theoretical framework for identifying some of the cognitive and emotional and social processes that I thought might be disrupted by stigma. And that framework ultimately led to the development of the first evidence-based mental health intervention among sexual minority populations. This is an intervention that my colleague, John Pachinkas, developed. And it targets many of the psychosocial mechanisms that I identified in that theoretical framework. And John has really done amazing work. He's now tested this intervention in many randomized controlled trials in different settings across the world and with different populations, different stigmas. And so I think, that it's a good example of the psychologist Kurt Lewin's quote that there's nothing so practical as a good theory, because it can really, in some cases, lead to the development of interventions that are hopefully capable of reducing health disparities.
Now, you mentioned that you recently moved back to a psychology department and that this provided an opportunity to examine how your structural approach to stigma could provide new insights into phenomena that psychologists care deeply about. Can you talk about some of these new findings?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll maybe focus on one recent project. We were really interested in asking whether the efficacy of psychotherapy interventions depends in part on the social context in which they're delivered. And this is a question that's, of obvious interest to clinical psychologists, my own background. And the assumption that we often make among many of these psychological interventions is that they'll be equally effective across all social contexts because they're targeting basic psychological and social processes that should be generalizable across contexts. But that's never really been tested before. And so we were interested in testing the validity of that assumption. And one of the methodological challenges, another theme of today that we confronted in answering this question is that, again, most mental health interventions, like stigma research I'd been mentioning before, are conducted in a single community. And that makes a lot of sense. I've been involved in some of these interventions, like the one I mentioned with John Pachinkas, and they're incredibly expensive and resource intensive to do just even in a single place, let alone trying to scale them up and do them across multiple different places. But again, since everyone's exposed to the same context when these interventions are only done in one place, there's really limited variation to detect any association between a contextual variable and intervention efficacy. And so to address that limitation, I was able to team up with one of my new colleagues in the psychology department here, John Weiss, and one of his former postdocs, Maggie Price, who took the lead on this project. And we used a new approach called a spatial meta-analysis. You've probably heard of regular meta-analysis, traditional meta-analysis, and this is very similar, but with the added step that you actually geocode or geolocate where these intervention studies are done. And then you link in measures of the contextual variable of interest to determine its association with the study outcome. And so in this particular project, we reanalyzed a large meta-analysis of 194 youth psychotherapy randomized control trials that my colleague John Weiss and his group have been conducting over the last several years. And the innovation here is that we took advantage of the fact that the interventions in this meta-analysis had been conducted across the US in communities that differed in terms of the level of racial prejudice in the communities where those interventions were done. So we measured racial prejudice here by aggregating individual racial attitudes that had been measured in a number of national surveys up to the community level in which those interventions were conducted. And then we linked in those measures into the meta-analysis. And we found that in intervention studies with majority Black youth, higher levels of racial prejudice in the communities where those interventions were conducted was associated with significantly lower intervention effect sizes, controlling for other contextual factors. In fact, the effect sizes were about 3 times as large in communities with the lowest levels of racial prejudice.
Wow.
And in contrast, we see no association in the non-stigmatized comparison group. So again, documenting result specificity. So given our other findings that I've been talking about adverse health consequences being more pronounced in high structural stigma context, these findings from our spatial meta-analysis, and we've done a couple others and another research group has replicated these findings too. So kind of all these findings together are beginning to suggest that these mental health interventions may be the least effective precisely in those communities where they're most needed. That is the high stigma context. And so I think this really, is kind of opening up an entirely new line of work in the area of intervention science and within psychology, where I think we need to think much more about how to adapt our psychological interventions to make them maximally effective in high stigma communities, even as we continue to target stigma at its source through structural interventions. So there's a lot of interest today in sort of precision medicine. And what I'd sort of like to encourage the field to think about too is kind of contextualized medicine. So here we're thinking about not only the sort of individual factors that predict how people respond to interventions, but also what are the social contexts in which they're in, and how do those contexts either make these interventions more effective or really undermine their efficacy in ways that we need to address through our intervention approaches.
Mark, your nominators for this award highlighted your mentorship style, which has been commended for its effectiveness and its inclusivity. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to know your thoughts about how collaboration and mentorship both play roles in shaping your research and in fostering the next generation of psychologists.
I think we can sometimes think that academia, I think, has this sort of stereotype of the solo individual who's sort of, toiling away in their lab and doing their work on their own. And of course, it takes individual ingenuity and drive to advance science. But my experience has really been that science is much more of a collective than an individual enterprise. And, the work that we've done in my lab you simply wouldn't have been possible without collaborating with other people. And that includes the collaborations with senior colleagues that I've been talking about so far, but also collaborations with students. And one of the reasons I love mentoring students is they bring in new ideas that can really take the work you've been doing in new and exciting directions, or they can take an initial finding and really run with it to understand it in all its complexity. So I actually have 3 grad students right now working in our lab, and all 3 have projects that I think are really significantly advancing our understanding of stigma. So one of my doctoral students, Emily Mellon, has an interest in the stigma associated with sexual violence. And she just created the first of its kind measure of structural sexual violence, where she's structural sexual violence stigma, where she's capturing state laws and attitudes that might affect survivors of sexual violence. And in part of her dissertation work, she's showing that individuals exposed to sexual violence they're about 30% more likely to report anxiety if they live in states with high levels of structural sexual violence stigma. Another one of my students, Nathan Hollenzed, is taking the finding that I just mentioned on structural stigma undermining the efficacy of psychological interventions. And he's now conducting his own large-scale spatial meta-analysis of psychological and behavioral interventions with LGBT individuals. So I think this project will provide important new insights about why we're seeing some of these findings. What is it about structural stigma that is undermining the efficacy of these intervention studies? And then finally, Rachel Martino, another doctoral student in the lab, has been interested in some of our initial findings from the theoretical model that I mentioned earlier, showing that stigma disrupts how stigmatized individuals both experience and respond to their emotions, something that has really important intervention implications. And she's in the process of conducting the first systematic review about the role of emotion processing and stigma across multiple marginalized groups. And I think that paper will really be sort of the go-to source for the field once it's published. And then finally, we've also been really lucky to have several Harvard undergrads working in the lab, and their curiosity and eagerness to really learn more about the science of stigma it's been so infectious, and just such a joy to get to work with them. And it's just one recent example, a student who just finished her defending her senior thesis in our lab. She was really interested in the stigma of low socioeconomic status based on her own lived experience. She's a first-generation student who experienced really considerable socioeconomic hardship growing up because of her parents' undocumented status. And in her thesis, she used a large nationally representative data set that we had been collecting in our lab and incorporated some new measures of stigma related to low socioeconomic status. And she's finding that the stigma of low SES is associated longitudinally with symptoms of depression, even after controlling for multiple objective measures of SES, like income and education and adulthood, and also childhood SES. And she's also showing that the stigma associated with low SES explains a really large proportion of the well-established association between income, education, and depression. So I think this is a great example of how, I mean, this is an undergrad student. It's an amazing project, and it's allowing us to explore some of the things we've been interested in and applying them to other stigmatized groups and statuses. So I guess just the last thing I'll say here is after I accepted the offer to join Harvard a couple years ago, the department asked me to come up with a new name for my lab. And I chose the rather pedestrian biopsychosocial effects of stigma lab because it created the acronym the BEST lab. And in addition to being, I don't know, somewhat cheeky, it was also aspirational. And I think that you can see from these examples that the students that I've had the privilege to work with have really lived up to the BEST lab name in every sense of the word.
Oh, that's so cool. You must have some great swag.
Yeah, yes, we have started to create those. And in fact, we have a new baby on the way in the lab. And so we now have to create some baby swag too. So yes, we're expanding in many, many directions. Yeah.
Well, actually, what you've just talked about is a great segue to my next question, which is to ask you what future directions you envision for research on the effects of structural stigma and its impact, and if there are any key areas you think researchers should focus on going forward.
Sure. So, I guess apropos of the previous question, one of the areas I'm actually most excited about in terms of future research is some work that I started with a former student, Tessa Charlesworth, who's now on the faculty at Kellogg at Northwestern. She's an assistant professor there, just started her first year. And Tessa's bringing both new measures and also methods to study really long-standing questions in the field about whether stigma can actually be reduced. And, it's interesting, we have some social science theories that suggest that one of the reasons it might be so hard to change stigma is because it actually serves multiple evolutionary, psychological, and social functions. So that is, stigma enables both individuals but also social groups to attain relevant goals, like exploiting others for economic gains or justifying the status quo. That is, individuals engage in stigmatization because they get something out of it. And so those theories raise the really provocative hypothesis that societies may actually maintain a relatively stable level of stigma across groups and over time. But it's been really difficult to test those hypotheses because our current measures rely on data that social scientists have already collected in their surveys and experiments, which means that we don't really have data over a long enough period of time to examine whether stigma does in fact persist over time and across groups. But Tessa created this kind of amazing new way to do that. So she uses a machine learning technique known as natural language processing. And her data set has over 8 billion words from roughly 500 million English language books. And she's using that to extract stereotype towards 58 stigmatized groups over a 100-year period from 1900 to 2000. And she accomplishes this through examining co-occurrences between words and text in a particular period of time. So for instance, every time woman is used in text, does it typically co-occur with stereotypic traits or contexts like meek or home, or with more agentic traits and contexts like assertive and office? And so in this data, Tessa takes the top 10 stereotypes that are most commonly associated with these 58 stigmatized groups in language in each decade over this 100-year period. And she can take out their stereotype valence. That is, how positive or negative are the stereotypes. And so with this data set, we were able to ask for the very first time whether stereotypes towards 58 stigmatized groups change at an aggregate societal level over the past century. And to cut to the chase, the really sort of concerning answer is no. Over 100 years of English language text, the negative stereotypes of this diverse set of groups have remained on aggregate. That is, when you average across all these groups, it's essentially a flat line. It's remarkably stable. And so that raises a lot of questions about, why are we seeing this stability? What are the mechanisms that uphold this kind of persistence of stereotypes and stigmatization over time? And so we're just in the beginning stages of putting together a new theoretical framework that identifies what some of those potential mechanisms might be. So just one example is reproducibility, in which stereotype negativity is just continually repeated towards a single target group over time. So in our data, for about a third of the groups, we see what we call really deep stability in the stereotypes, in which stereotypes remain completely unchanged over the past century. So that is, a group, say, is viewed as lazy in 1900 and lazy again in 2000. So the exact same stereotypes are used even over a 100-year period. But then for another set of groups, we see that new traits emerge, but they have the same underlying latent negativity and general latent meaning. So for example, a group is viewed as lazy in 1900, but is helpless in 2000, with helpless being really similar in terms of underlying negative valence and also underlying negative meaning in terms of coldness and incompetence. So I think these initial findings are really kind of setting up a whole new way of exploring some really important questions about the challenges of stigma change through a historical lens. And we're really hoping to dig into these data even more to explore some of the social and political and economic conditions that may lead to variability in the possibility of stigma change over time, with the ultimate goal of being able to identify factors that might be targeted in structural interventions aimed at reducing stigma.
Thank you. How would you define impact in psychology?
I love that question. I do, yeah. I mean, I think that I guess the first thing I'll say is, as you've seen, I take sort of a pretty big tent approach to our work, and I think defining impact also requires a similarly, expansive perspective. So I already talked a little bit about this earlier in our conversation in terms of some of the ways our work has been used to have impact. And I think that's often kind of when we we think of when we think about this question. That is, a psychologist or group of psychologists produce a body of evidence that leads to some change in policy or practice. And there are lots of examples of psychologists who have had that kind of impact, and it's certainly a really important way that leads to impact. But I guess I sort of want to put a plug in for some impact that also occurs through just more basic science. And this may sound somewhat uninspired, I guess, but I think of the ways in which the creation of a single data set that a group of research creates can end up just sort of completely transforming a field. So I'm thinking of examples like the Fragile Families data set in terms of advancing our understanding of poverty and adversity and the long-term impacts of those exposures, or the ABCD data set in terms of advancing our understanding of social context effects on brain development, something we've been involved in more recently in our lab that I didn't get a chance to talk about. And in our own work, so much of what we did, especially early on, was only possible through data sets that other researchers had created that had sampled individuals across a range of contexts that included measures of stigmatized identity so that we could identify the stigmatized groups in the sample, that measured health and other psychosocial outcomes, and that provided the geographic indicators that told us where people live that enabled us to link in some of those measures of structural stigma. So I think all of those really examples speak to the impact of kind of large-scale novel data structures for our field. And I also think of that impact can occur through the creation of new methods, and especially in ways maybe that weren't apparent when they were first created. So I doubt those involved in the creation of natural language processing, for example, could have imagined at the time that the method would one day provide us with a whole new way of exploring some of the possibilities and also challenges of changing stigma. And yet with that method, we can now explore these questions really for the first time. And then finally, I think in thinking about impact, I think it can also be productive to think about factors not only that sort of facilitate impact like I've been talking about, but also that might impede it. So I think, as we talked about today, I think one of the biggest ways that impact in psychology can occur is through the interdigitation with other disciplines. As I mentioned, our work has really benefited enormously from collaborations with colleagues in a range of disciplines like sociology and political science and law and epidemiology, to name a few. And I think this learning, it doesn't have just to be one way. I think our findings also show the benefits of psychological approaches to our sister social science disciplines, like in the case of sociology, where we've been able to show some of the psychological mechanisms through which broad macrostructural factors end up contributing to health. But unfortunately, I think that there are a range of institutional and practical barriers that really kind of hinder the ability to create and sustain these kind of multidisciplinary collaborations. I think that's starting to change, but I think we have a lot more work to do to really reduce those barriers if we want to truly maximize our impact.
Apropos of something you mentioned a few moments ago, I'm wondering if there is anything that we haven't yet covered that you'd like to share. I mean, your experience is clearly both deep and very, very broad. What haven't we touched on so far?
I think that these have been a great range of questions that have sort of enabled us to really talk about a lot of the different areas that we've been really fortunate to work in. I guess the last thing I'll say is for people who are still kind of wondering at the end of this, why is it important to study structural stigma? I think I'll just say kind of two things about that. I think that the first is that psychologists have really long known that stigmatized individuals can experience negative outcomes even if no one else is immediately present in the situation. When we think about stigma, we kind of immediately think about concrete events and experiences that happen to people, like discriminatory treatment. And those are certainly important ways in which stigma operates to produce disadvantage. But again, negative outcomes can happen even without someone in the immediate situation. So it's just one example in the LGBT space, until 2015, state constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage in the U.S. denied same-sex couples access to the more than 1,000, someone counted them up, I think there's something like 1,100 and some odd benefits and rights and privileges that were attendant to the institution of marriage. And so in that example, there's no single individual who's doing the discrimination, and yet the law is really structuring people's access to resources in ways that can affect their lives. And then secondly, psychologists have also shown us that negative outcomes can occur even without the conscious awareness of the stigmatized. So as an example of a Black family that's denied a bank loan because they are, unbeknownst to them, targets of redlining practices. And so I think those two brief examples really illustrate that a comprehensive understanding of stigma really requires explicit consideration of its structural manifestations. So those are just some of the reasons that I think it's really important to think about stigma as a multi-level factor, and that we need to address it at all three levels. And in fact, these levels don't exist in isolation. Some of our recent work is showing that stigma at the structural level is affecting the experiences of stigma at the individual and interpersonal level as well. So really exploring all of these in combination gives us a much more sort of comprehensive understanding of the ways in which stigma contributes to health and health inequalities.
We are now going to turn to our participants for their questions. Whoa. Well, I thought we would. As it turns out, no one has asked anything in the question box yet. So
they're so overwhelmed by your great questions.
Yeah, well, rather than have it be open mic on my part, I thought I would just tap dance a little bit here by observing, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about when I started my first writing project and I didn't even know practitioners, which I was at the time, could write anything, but I was asked to write a book chapter on a book that was published in 1991 on, and I believe the title was Homosexuality, which is a term we were using in those days, research implications for public policy. And, thinking about stigma from a very rudimentary level. Well, I shouldn't say rudimentary, maybe I should just say from, the origins and first how we thought about it as being really a very personal phenomenon, or an interpersonal, or at most maybe an intergroup phenomenon. But this work, I mean, part of why I find it so exciting is that you are really taking it to the next level, where we're looking at the social context in which all of this is enshrined. And the use of the word structural seems to me to be entirely appropriate, because it feels like it all depends on the very social structures that have led us to feel some of those personal health disparities when, for example, we're living in a jurisdiction that has passed laws or is creating or where there's been judicial action that is antithetical to who we are as people, as human beings, the way that we identify, so much so that I can't help but think these folks who are living in states with similar demographics to those around, but the ones where there have been discrimination protections rolled back or prohibited, or access to appropriate care has been limited, are suffering worse mental health outcomes, and by extension, I would think at risk for worse physical health outcomes, right? Because, if we're living in a state of constant anxiety, or even if it's, that phenomenon of going to the grocery store and looking around at neighbors, wondering, have you voted for some kind of law that will harm me as an individual? Or are you a safe person even to be around? You know, what's the propensity for even for violence or physical stigma that these broader contextual factors have a direct impact on people's well-being, you know, and
Yeah.
you know.
I think, you know, a couple comments on that. I think one, most of this work started in the area of mental health, but it has been expanded to physical health conditions as well. So researchers are getting really interested in exploring some of the physical health consequences of structural stigma, and generally finding similar effects of what we're seeing in the space of mental health. You know, I think that one of the reasons for inserting structural in front of stigma is that, you know, although stigma is inherently a social process, I mean, Bruce Link and Joe Phelan talk about this in their widely used definition. The very first step of stigma is the labeling of group differences. There are literally thousands of group differences that we have among us as individuals, but we only select a handful of them and mark them as socially salient. And they use the term label because it speaks to the fact that someone is doing the labeling, someone is selecting certain characteristics as socially salient and saying that they're important, and then attaching stereotypes to those labels. Whereas some of the field that has some researchers in the past had used the term mark, which makes it feel much more as a sort of individual level. It's something about individuals. And there's been a lot of pushback in the field because of that. And so I think that sociologists really remind us often that this is inherently a social and structural process. And when you bring in these measures of stigma that are not at the individual level, they're not about individual appraisals, but much more about what's the objective social context surrounding individuals, it really helps to sort of highlight that finding. And then I think the last thing I'll say too is that your comments reminded me of is that one of the questions we often get is, you know, some of the examples I was talking about today talk about some of the negative consequences of when structural stigma is implemented. But do you find the reverse? Do you find the flip side where what happens when laws and policies and attitudes begin to become you know, more expansive and more inclusive and less stigmatizing? Do you see health benefits? And we've been able to do several studies. We and others have been able to do several studies looking at what happens when laws and policies are moving in the opposite direction towards more inclusion and more protection. And there we are finding improvements in health. And in fact, in some contexts, in Sweden, we have some colleagues there. And that's one of the environments that's really undergone some of the most pronounced and protracted declines in structural stigma at a population level over the last sort of 2-3 decades. And there, during a period where some of the strongest declines in structural stigma were occurring between about 2005 and 2015, we found that over that 10-year period, the sexual orientation disparity in mental distress had been eliminated by 2015, whereas it had been elevated by about 3. Gay and lesbians were about 3 times more likely to meet criteria for psychological distress in 2015. But 10 years later, following this really pronounced decline in structural stigma at a population level, the disparity had been eliminated. So I think it really speaks to the fact that these disparities aren't inevitable, but they're responsive to changes in the social context, and in particular to reductions and declines in structural stigma.
That's great. I'm so glad to hear that about my family's home country. You know, we hear that. Actually, a lot of my experience over there is very much matches that. It's a very, very, at least as regards some group differences, a rather positive and an environment where people can thrive, which is why they're dealing, of course, now with their own immigration issues. But I am, let's see, we had a question but apparently you have answered it, but I'm wondering, I think I'll just pose it to you, Mark, and then you can see if you would like to elaborate, which is your research validates my own feelings about systemic change. For these kinds of stigmas and stereotypes, they're very sticky. They are hard to change, even in groups that claim being open to such change. I am wondering to what degree you feel hopeful that we will find a path forward. Structural seems key. Is there anything else you'd like to say in addition to the example of Sweden that you just gave?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question. I mean, I am an optimist at heart, and yet when you study this topic, it can be dispiriting. And I think that, you know, these data also, the natural language processing data that I was talking over a 100-year period, I think really validated some of my assumptions about or beliefs about how sticky and challenging it is to address stigma. And what does give me hope, though, is a couple things. I think first and foremost, it's that when you look at most of our interventions to try and reduce stigma and prejudice and related concepts, many of them don't really take these social science theories about the functions that underlie stigmatization seriously. Again, these theories are about, and this is very sociological, it's not a really psychological, as much of a psychological kind of approach, but to think about what do stigmatizers get out of stigmatizing? That there are these functions that underlie stigmatization, and so but the good news of that means that there are a lot of challenges to addressing it because people are actually getting it serves functions and there are motivations that underlie it, but there are of course countervailing motivations, altruism and social connection, and so I think that how do we sort of upregulate those sort of more pro-social ways of interacting and sort of downregulate the stigmatization? That's the key question. But the good news is most of our interventions aren't really trying to test that. They're not taking this sort of motivational or functional approach to heart. Most of them instead are continuing to think about reducing stigma through education campaigns or through perspective taking and empathy building, and all of that is useful and important. But I mean, Betsy Pollack just did a great systematic review of this literature a couple of years ago in the annual reviews of psychology, and shows that by and large, most of our prejudice interventions are not really moving the needle. And she really, in particular, calls out the need for structural interventions and multi-level interventions. And so I think that what gives me hope is that the field isn't trying in many ways the things that I think might have more traction in terms of leading to change. So I think, kind of being good stigma scholars and going back to the literature and back to some of these more fundamental theories about stigma and the functions that they may serve may give some purchase in terms of thinking about what those interventions might be. And then I also think what gives me hope is these kinds of new data sets that Tessa's creating. I didn't have a chance to mention, but there's yet another one that we're working on that is actually geocoded, meaning that we know where the words in language are coming from because they're from newspapers. It's about a 200-year data set of newspapers. And so we can really drill down on where are the places where these stereotypes are higher and lower, and where are they changing over time? And so then we can really look at what are the structural characteristics, what are the political factors, what are the social factors, what are the economic factors at a societal level that might be leading to the places that are changing the most. And what are the places that are the stickiest, where things aren't changing? What's unique about those places in terms of the politics and economics and social conditions? For instance, is there less intergroup contact or less geographic mobility in those places that are leading to persistence? So those are, again, kinds of questions that we've been able to ask in a more qualitative way. Historians and others have sort of asked these in kind of case study type ways, but we haven't had these kind of large scale multi-group longitudinal data sets over really long periods of time that would enable change to really occur to be able to answer them. And so that gives me some hope too, that we just haven't had until recently the types of data structures to be able to look at some of these questions that I'm hoping will reveal some insights into when stigma change is possible in ways that will help us design better structural interventions and perhaps intergroup and individual level interventions as well to try and move the needle more.
Well, I mean, I think that's so great to hear a bit of your optimism, especially in times like this right now, where I mean, we're experiencing this intense polarization in this country and everything that's been going on about, certainly not just the structural stigma that associates itself with our LGBTQ community, but when you think about everything, who's, the rights of women, to have agency over their own bodies, so much is on the line these days. That thinking in positive terms sometimes, I think, for a lot of us becomes a little elusive. So thank you for what you have, what you've contributed. We do have another question, which is, how do you bring your research into the classroom?
Well, I teach a class called Stigma, Discrimination, and Health to undergrads, and it is one of my absolute favorite parts of my job. And I, really try and structure the class around this idea of thinking about stigma at multiple levels. So we actually spend a whole week on stigma at the individual level, a week on stigma at the interpersonal level, a week on stigma at the structural level. And then we think then another week on how do we intervene against reducing stigma at the individual, interpersonal, and structural level. So that framework really gets sort of folded into the class. But then, as I hope you sort of seen today too, I think that when you study stigma, you really, we haven't just focused on a single population. We've looked at how stigma affects a whole range of stigmatized groups. And I really fold that into the class by students get to choose a stigmatized group that they focus on throughout the semester. And then each week we have a weekly application task where they apply the readings and content from the lecture to the stigmatized group. So each week is something different. For example, one week, the unit on structural stigma, they have to come up with measures of structural stigma against the group that they're focusing on for this semester. Another week, they have to write a policy memo to a congressman from their district arguing for a particular policy that might reduce structural forms of stigma for that group. So I had one student who called it a choose your own adventure class, where you get to sort of choose the stigma that you're focusing on, and then they really get to learn a lot about that particular stigma, and then they share that each week with the class of what they're learning. So it becomes a way for for the students to really, and me to really learn about stigmas that we may not know as much about, so it becomes a nice sort of teaching moment in that way too. So it's a really fun class, and students again really bring so much sort of energy and curiosity and openness to learning about stigma and how it operates. So that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I would also dare say that there are a lot of us around the country who use the concepts of structural stigma in teaching a variety of subjects. For example, I'm teaching this quarter a class in multicultural issues in psychological testing and assessment. And I always start with a description of structural stigma and how to think about all of the moving parts of that, including the history of psychological testing in general and how it is almost in some ways set up to provide a more privileged experience or a more devalued experience depending on who's taking the test and all that. So we have a couple more comments. A couple more comments. One is some feedback for you, which is terrific presentation. This final answer about how we can understand change answers my main question. Wonderful, life-changing work and great questions. How can the field support this remarkable paradigm?
Well, I think funding for this work is challenging. So I think that is certainly one way. The creation of these new types of data sets that I mentioned is very challenging. So funding is always needed for this type of work. So I think that's one way that I think is really useful, is funding. And then I think that just a continued openness and appreciation to what these kind of structural and contextual approaches can really bring to the broader field, not just in stigma, but as I hope kind of my brief example of psychological interventions really highlighted, that this kind of structural approach that you bring to the study of stigma, I think, can really yield new insights into all kinds of outcomes that we psychologists care about. The efficacy of our interventions. I didn't have time to talk about it today, but some of the new work we've been doing showing that the social context affects brain development and brain structure in youth. And so I think it's kind of a new paradigm for thinking about social context effects on psychological outcomes. And so I think the field is I think beginning to really show a real openness to that kind of way of thinking. And so I'm looking forward to sort of seeing where in future work how we can kind of continue to move that needle.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, this is really not a question. It is just, again, some more feedback and comment from an audience member who says, as an older psychologist, I've been humbled by what has been missing in my points of view, by what I have been learning about systemic bias. Makes me very excited to fold in sociological and other interdisciplinary approaches to my own thinking about change. May the social sciences begin to be honored in our political worlds.
Yes.
From her lips to the goddess's ears. Thank you for this chat. And let me just quickly say to our participants, if you have any questions for Dr. Hatzenbuehler, now would be the time to put them in the Q&A box. Otherwise, we will head toward wrapping it up, because I see no further questions from the audience. So let me just conclude by thanking you, Mark, for taking the time to speak with all of us. It really is an honor and very exciting to learn more about you and to celebrate your commitment and impact on the field of psychology. Congratulations again on your well-deserved Gold Medal Award. And to all of you, thank you who have been joining us today. And be sure not to miss our final fireside chat in June with Dr. Jillian Shepard. Visit the events page on the APF website to register for this and other upcoming conversations. Mark, thank you again for spending some time with us this afternoon. It really, really has been a privilege and a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure as well, and appreciate the opportunity and the invitation.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
You as well.